Thanks so much, Alicia. And thank you all for being here today. So I wanted to share out some introductions of our speakers here today, honored guests. And first I want to start with Representative Tana Sanchez of District 43 of North and Northeast Portland. Representative Sanchez has spent her life working to strengthen all of the communities, Native communities included. Tana is Shoshone-Bannock, Ute, and Carrizo, and grew up in Portland, and for many years has been a leader fighting for the rights of women, Indigenous people, and the most vulnerable. As Director of Family Services at the NEA Family Center, Tana has helped create the Early College Academy, expanded early childhood services, affordable housing development, elder support, and many different programs that support the communities in our area. Next, I want to introduce Dr. Corcoran, Chippewa Cree, who is a director of the Indian Law Program at Lewis and Clark Law School. She's an adjunct professor in the Indigenous Nations Studies program at PSU and at Salish Kootenai Tribal College. Dr. Corcoran is very active throughout the community as a scholar and fellowship, as well as an author. And just to share Dr. Corcoran's book, The Incarceration of Native American Women as a Societal Issue, Approach to Applying Gentle Action Theory, will be published by the University of Nebraska Press in the spring of 2023. So we really look forward to that. And finally, David Simmons has over 30 years of professional experience in child welfare services as a direct service provider and in program and policy development. Their primary focus has been on improving child welfare and children's mental health services to American Indian and Alaska Native children. He is currently the Director of Governmental Affairs and Advocacy at the National Indian Child Welfare Association in Portland and works extensively with tribal, federal, and state governments, as well as private organizations. So we just want to thank you each for being here and sharing your time with us today. We really look forward to learning together here collectively, and thank you again.
Thank you, Candace. I think that what we're going to do is by introduction, just give each speaker 10 to 15 minutes to talk about tribal sovereignty and what that looks like in their role. So up first, we have Representative Tana Sanchez.
Great, thank you, Alicia. As was mentioned, I am the state representative for House District 43 North and Northeast Portland, and I'm also the Director of Family Services at NEA Family Center. And so over the years, of course, I've had a unique perspective on the issue of sovereignty just because of my political activism as a younger person. And then when I got into the legislature, it was an interesting thing to watch because, as some of you will know, I am only the second Native American to ever serve in the Oregon legislature. And what was, I say interesting because what was interesting was that any bill that may be mentioned or should have but didn't mention Native Americans, tribal participation, or tribal government to government sort of interaction was sort of brought to me like, oh my God, what do we do? It's as if they finally noticed that it wasn't happening. And that was amazing to me. I actually had to testify on several bills that were like the cleanup bills, essentially, because things had been forgotten over and over again. It was really, really, truly amazing. And then, even though so many of the tribal folks and Native activists and people were bringing bills that were really, really important and that we understood to be so necessary in the grand scheme of things. You'll remember Senate Bill 13, the tribal curriculum for Oregon tribes to be embedded into public school systems. That was already well in process by the time I entered the legislature, and I just had the fortune to carry it onto the floor. That bill was so very, very important, and even now as we sit with it, getting implemented in the process, it got funded. It's moving through, the curriculum is developed, the tribes are still struggling with enforcing it to be put into school into school development, like into the whole process of teaching, which is, it's kind of amazing still to me that we're in this place where tribal sovereignty is recognized on some levels, but not really enforced or not really pushed to the degree that it could. Years ago, the Legislative Commission on Indian Services was developed, and that office sits in the Capitol itself. And part of its job is to work with the 9 federally recognized tribes here in Oregon, and to bring the issues that the tribes have to the government. That's, that's what it was intended to do. Now, to a degree, it maybe didn't do it as well as it could have in the past, but that has picked up quite a bit in recent years. And I believe it's actually doing a great job, to the point where at this point in time, we are looking at legislation that actually did develop on the federal level, and we may grab that and move it here on the state level, that really acknowledges and puts forth a plan for what's termed as tribal consultation. Because tribal consultation is required in the state for the state to actually consult with the tribes in their different agency areas, that they're supposed to, but they don't always. And so you may recall that recently there was a lot of hubbub about a racetrack and a possible somewhat casino type thing, which it actually was going to be a casino in Southern Oregon, that was stopped because the appropriate tribal consultation did not happen. And in the state of Oregon, only tribes have casinos. That is the law. That is the law of the state of Oregon. And the fact that that tribal consultation didn't occur is part of the reason it stopped. But it's also because, again, the law says that only tribes have casinos. And the company that was building that racetrack was trying to pretend as if what they had built was not a game of, not a game of chance, that it, which it is. The machines and the things that they wanted to put in there were in fact a game of chance, hence gambling. So it's a different situation altogether. But again, over and over, those conversations come up in the legislature. What are we required to do, and why don't we do it? Right. And I will say that part of the reason is because, again, your average human being doesn't understand what tribal sovereignty means. They don't understand the government to government relationship. They don't understand, they almost think of us as being gone in the world, which is really sad and amazing to a degree. And, having experienced that maybe as a younger person as well, having conversations with people like, oh my God, I didn't even know Indians still existed in the world. I thought you were extinct. How amazing is that to hear something like that they thought we were extinct, that the government had wiped us out. Not that there was not malice and intent in there somewhere to wipe us out, but that didn't happen. So government to government relationships means, and tribal sovereignty piece means that we are, sovereign nations, that the government has to have a relationship with us and conversation about things. That's a requirement. And they don't always do it. And we need to try to figure out how we make that happen better. But that's some of the stuff that I've been dealing with on a pretty consistent basis. And there are multiple examples of that type of thing that happen in the legislature all the time. And I'll give you one more example, and then let other folks sort of introduce their perspectives on it as well. When I first got into the legislature, there was a bill that essentially created this wonderful grant program for veterans organizations and it listed out the different types of organizations that could apply for those funds to display, different pieces about veterans on roadsides and create monuments of that type of thing. And it didn't include the tribes. So it essentially eliminated their ability to apply for those funds. And the fact that we had to come back in the following year and create and do an amendment to that bill, and that the chair of the Veterans Committee sat next to me and essentially had, and I explained the bill and why it was necessary. And the chair of the Veterans Committee just said, yes, she's right. We messed up. We didn't acknowledge what we needed to acknowledge. And then people on the committee literally saying something like, Are you sure that's necessary? Why is it necessary? It's necessary because they are a government and they are their own tribal nation. They are a separate nation. The United States government does not make treaties with itself. It makes treaties with sovereign governments. And that's who we are. That's why it's necessary.
Thank you, Representative Sanchez. We're now going to pass it to Dr. Corcoran. You are muted.
My students know me so well. I'm so old that I actually appoint an audio visual aid for my classes, and they help me through. So first of all, thank you for the invitation. You know, this is a subject that is certainly part of my life's work, as certainly a professor that teaches the Introduction to Native American Studies class at Portland State, also an upper level theory class, Salish Kootenai, and directing the Indian Law program here at Lewis and Clark. I'm fortunate to be the advisor to the Native American law students. I hire the professors that teach in my program, and I also get to develop the courses that we offer. And their learning curve is huge. That concept of sovereignty. And so something I point out to the students is that no matter what practice of law they're going into, whether it's business or certainly we have the #1 environmental law school in the nation, so we have a big draw there, but it doesn't matter. Tax law, every body of law intersects with the rights of Native American people. Certainly the lack of understanding of what is sovereignty and having to explain many times a year that sovereignty was not granted to us. Sovereignty is inherent. We were recognized as government people from the moment that footsteps other than ours were set on this land. The negotiations between whatever government existed from the beginning on up to the development of what is now considered the government of the United States, there were interactions with tribal people. Certainly, another aspect is that what we have is not created specially for us. It was, and it's our job to protect so that it always will be. For example, you know, living in the Pacific Northwest, I actually have a son-in-law who's Danish, who's a crabber, and he also fishes other types of fish. So in the 20 years he's been my son-in-law, there's some learning moments about how many fish do Native Americans get to take out of the water and why. And something I point out in my classes all the time is, you know, we all hear these adages of being an American, of, you know, the right to health, happiness, prosperity, all of these things. Whereas for the Native American, they are guaranteed certain rights, such as usual and accustomed places, which can be argued by others. Also, some treaty rights when it comes to fish or other game, the right to subsist. There's a great deal of difference between subsist and rolling in prosperity. And so we have got to protect what is ours because it's always been ours. And we want to protect that for the future generations. Also, I think too, that is recognizing that we are also a political system. And I'm happy to say, you know, as a supporter of Representative Sanchez, to see what's happening across Indian country with Indigenous women taking office from the local to the state to the federal level. We, I believe, are starting to flex our political power. We've got to do more. And I always use the example too of what happened in Montana. What happened in Montana when, and please know that I am a Montana Indian, I'm Chippewa Cree, I'm from Rocky Boy. And when the Crows invited he whom I shall never name, who used to sit in that Oval Office in that White House, oh boy, I tell you, the tribes were not happy. So there was a huge get out the vote. The tribal vote in Montana went through the roof. And we were able to actually turn some seats blue for the first time in Montana history. And I think it's a really good lesson of we have got to practice our political power and flex it. And one of those ways is groups like this. There's other groups that are really training Indigenous women to run for political office. And we need to be doing much more of that. I think too, you know, something that was mentioned by Alicia in the invitation was that it's not a matter of race. Being Indian is not about race. It's about being a citizen of a tribal nation. You can't buy your way in. However, that citizenship is so important for us to protect, for us to continue to use to serve what our people need. Something that was, you know, I think that Tana mentioned was that this message, which, you know, has permeated education and this society of that somehow we're not here anymore, is really something we've got to come against. I had a student in my class who is from one of the 9 tribes of Oregon, who in reading the book, which is a really tough book, and it's truth telling about the history of the United States from an Indigenous perspective. When she read that book and we talked about it in class a week ago, she was in tears because she said that it hurts her to think that others don't acknowledge us, that they don't think that we're here, and that we've been erased. And oh my gosh, the whole class was in tears. And, you know, really in college, that's usually not the goal for everybody, but in tears. But how fabulous that this class exists. And that she herself, because she didn't speak her native language, she worried that she wasn't Indian enough. And her classmates, certainly myself, you know, told her verbally, you are enough. Your ancestors' blood and breath runs through you. But these are messages that are sent from the outside world. And sometimes, unfortunately, something I lecture on a lot, it's never popular, lateral oppression. And so we have to be strong in our identity, our sovereignty, our rights, with both this outer society that we're a part of, and within our own societies. And so recognizing that all that comes with sovereignty, the self-rule, the distinct political entity, the nationhood, all of these things are key. And the other really tough reality is that our sovereignty is always under onslaught. And so we've got to be strong, we've got to turn out students, law students, leaders that understand and protect our sovereignty. So that's kind of, what I do every day. And I just appreciate spending some time with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Corcoran. And now, David Simmons from NICWA.
Thank you, Alicia, and thank you for our two speakers too. I really had all kinds of thoughts going through my head while I was listening to both of you. I think you heard a little bit in the introduction about my professional experience, but let me tell you a little bit about who I am as a person. So I grew up in rural southeast Nebraska, and I went to one-room schoolhouse for 1st through 4th grade, and then after that it was a consolidated school district all the way through 12th grade. I grew up and there was only one person of color in my whole educational experience that I ever met. And I didn't meet that person until they moved into their family moved into our school district when I was in 11th grade. So I was pretty sheltered. But I remember in our history course, which was taught by my wrestling coach, and I really loved my wrestling coach because I loved wrestling. And he was moving through all of this, interesting American histories, all the way through kind of current time. And then he spent like the whole semester doing this. And then there was one moment where for about 2 minutes, he mentioned that, oh, by the way, there are tribal governments too, or tribes, I think he called them, too, and they're mentioned in the Constitution. And then that was the end of it. So this idea of being invisible, I mean, Native people in the Midwest, to me, were invisible. And I've learned a lot more about what that means since I started working in Indian country. I've also learned more about colonization. So as Europeans came to North America, colonizers, they have a strategy, a recipe for how they colonize indigenous peoples, and it's the same all around the world, and it happened here. So they do 4 things. They concentrate on 4 things. One is that they steal the land. They take control of the land and all of the resources contained within the land. The second thing that they do is they outlaw culture, essentially. Spirituality, ceremony, all of the things, healing, all of the things that help keep people in balance and well. And then they also take the kids because they recognize that we've got to assimilate, we've got to essentially take the indigenous thought and identity out of them. And the 4th thing that they do is they disrupt the government. They disrupt all governance activity developed by tribal people. And one of the things I find interesting is that, our own US government, our constitutional government, is really based upon the Iroquois Confederacy. Not many people know that. They assume that there was just a kind of a brainstorm and this kind of was developed. Well, actually there was an indigenous model about democracy that was used in a lot of ways. Not the way it's practiced, but at least the way it was developed and conceptualized. So as you can probably tell from the organization I work for, I spend a lot of time on human services and child welfare, particularly. And one of the things I've learned about child welfare over the years, just in general, is that, governments are necessary to help keep children safe and keep families strong. They shouldn't be in a position of raising children. They don't make good parents. Governments don't do that, but they need to work in partnership, because what do governments do? Governments do the things that we can't do as individuals or communities. things like helping promote additional resources and provide resources and even structure sometimes. And there's a lot of discussion about what the role of community in child welfare should be, and families and government. But the idea that government is a part of that, is a key player, is important. So the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is really the seminal child welfare legislation that is specifically addresses Native people, recognizes tribal sovereignty throughout its provisions. And this is not an accident. This is not a concept, as you've heard. ICWA recognizes tribal sovereignty authority by recognizing tribal exclusive jurisdiction, so jurisdiction over child welfare proceedings and matters on their own tribal lands. Also allowing the transfer of state jurisdiction cases involving Native people to tribal jurisdiction. So even going as far as reaching off of the tribal lands into state jurisdiction and actually petitioning and bringing it back to tribal jurisdiction. And then also providing for full faith and credit to public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of tribes. Now those are things that are you only see these kinds of things happening between governments when there's a recognition of sovereignty. So as you heard earlier, the federal government doesn't have treaties with organizations, they have treaties with sovereign nations. And the same goes for in child welfare. And ICWA also encourages a step further, states and tribal nations to enter into intergovernmental agreements with each other. Here in the state of Oregon, all of the tribes in Oregon have some sort of intergovernmental agreement with the state. Some are more robust than others, but they all have some form of agreement and recognition. These are government to government based. And in these agreements and the examples of jurisdiction and recognition of inherent tribal sovereignty, it speaks not just to the importance in child welfare anyway, of intergovernmental cooperation, but also the sovereign nation status of tribal nations as in their relations with state sovereigns, states. So even in times going back into the 50s, which was a dark time for many tribes, because the federal government was in a period where they called it the termination era. And many of the tribes around the country, especially on the West Coast, found their federal recognition terminated. And part of the laws that were passed during that time, one of them was called Public Law 280. It's still referred to it that way today. And the federal government and Congress then provided concurrent jurisdiction in civil domestic matters like child welfare to states. So Oregon, with the exception of 2 tribes here, is a Public Law 280 state. But even in those very controversial and very failed policies, even in those, the federal government recognized that tribes have jurisdiction and have sovereign authority. So it's there really is, right now we're working on this Supreme Court case that's coming up, the Brackeen v. Howland case. And the state of Texas is asking the Supreme Court to essentially disregard 200 years of precedence of tribal sovereign authority, tribal governance, and all of these are, court cases, treaties, acts of Congress. And so the only way that they can prevail is if they convince the Supreme Court to just ignore all of that precedent. That is the only way. And the interesting side note to this is the state of Texas has federally recognized tribes within their boundaries. And they have agreements, intergovernmental agreements with those tribes, which have been on the books for some time. And they've even passed state statutes recognizing tribal jurisdiction and tribal authority. So it's Texas as the protagonist in this isn't even following their own precedent in regard to their relations with tribal nations and within their own boundaries. So it's really clear to me, and has been for the 30 plus years I've been doing Indian child welfare work, that when tribal nations sovereignty is respected and empowered and supported, that not only do tribal nations do better, but so do states as well. There have been research studies that have shown that states really highly depend on tribal nations to help children and families heal, to find substitute care placements when children can't be at home temporarily, or if they need a permanent home, or even in trying to find just the right kinds of services to heal people from trauma, oftentimes intergenerational trauma. And so when tribal nations are stronger and their sovereignty is stronger, so is the ability to partner with states and be a stronger partner. So I'm just going to stop there, but I want to just say thank you very much for inviting me. I appreciate this is a topic not specifically that I get to talk about often, but I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, David. So we're going to use this time to open up to some questions from our presenters, and we're going to try to do this as calmly as possible. So if you could raise your hand and with your question, we will do our best to monitor that. And is there anybody who has any questions for the speakers? I have one in the chat here. It says, how do you recommend Oregon government and Oregonians appreciate tribal sovereignty for Indigenous descendants not associated with formally recognized tribes? And it doesn't say.
That's a good one. I'm going to take a swing at it, and then you all chip in. I think what's difficult about that question is that it sounds to me like they're talking about groups that aren't federally recognized. So something to remember is that there are tribal people living in every state that are tribal people. They may not have federal recognition. Some have state recognition. Some do not. And the process to be recognized is onerous, to say the least. So I think one of the ways is, even in our opening today by Alicia, where she acknowledged the people of this place, that governments acknowledge that there are people of this place and other places that may not be card-carrying Indians, but they are still part of our communities. It's important that we protect their sovereign rights. Another thing too, as I referenced my student and also what Tana said, is that we need to make sure that we are not erased, no matter who we are, no matter, if we're recognized or not, in the eyes of society. And I think that governments need to have a way, perhaps, of acknowledging them. I realize that legally they may not have to have liaisons and interact. But even if they don't, many times the people that are serving on committees and boards are not from a federally recognized tribe. And so they're still here. And so I just think that it's important to always be educating our governments. So that's my swing at it.
So let me just say from the perspective of, you know, what I deal with every day in terms of the law, you know, in terms of Oregon law, the state of Oregon, the government of the state of Oregon, doesn't have a responsibility to recognize indigenous descendants. It's the tribes that get to decide that, whether or not they recognize someone who is a descendant within their nation. They have the full capacity to recognize that or not. It's up to them. And then I just want to sort of maybe touch on the word indigenous, because indigenous means a lot more than Oregon tribes or United States tribes, Canadian tribes, Mexican, South Central America tribes. It, you know, it recognizes Alaska, you know, tons and tons of different tribes. That's what that word means. It doesn't, it means indigenous. And the word indigenous even recognizes, you know, Australian Aboriginal folks, or, you know, any other folks who are indigenous to their own populations, right, to their own land. So it's a little bit different, and maybe a little, well, because people have worked so hard in you know, in particular in the United States, and different tribes, to sort of really push our tribal sovereignty, and to require that of the United States government and state and local governments, to require them having a distinct understanding of what tribal sovereignty means. To have the word indigenous almost water that down to a little bit is somewhat offensive. And so people don't, a lot of tribal populations, not everybody, but some tribal populations are like, yeah, that word indigenous. Don't call me indigenous. I am from a federally recognized tribes, and you have a responsibility to recognize that as such, right? So it's a little bit of a, it's almost right in there, I think, with whether or not you refer to us as American Indians, Native Americans, and or Indians. We will recognize that the Indian is in the Constitution, and that is the law. So you will recognize us by the law. Okay, does that make sense? Hopefully that's clearer, because again, very distinct. You know, and sometimes I used to tell people it depended on how old you are, was whether or not you referred to yourself as an American Indian or a Native American, or just Indian, because again, but now it's much more distinctly identified as the legal aspect of things. And so requiring that word, you know, any of the bills that I've had to push forward, once that word indigenous or BIPOC started to come into the legislature, I had to really push that they identify very distinctly the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, or the Oregon federally recognized tribes, or however we put it, but it had to be identified very specifically like that, so that the word indigenous didn't water down sovereignty for them.
In child welfare, the you know, the Indian Child Welfare Act only is applicable to, you know, children who are members of federally recognized tribes. So there's oftentimes discussion and even debate about, what about all of the other Native children who are, you know, living on tribal lands, who have Native ancestry, all of that. And as you've heard, only tribal governments make those decisions about who their citizens are. But there are still things that can be done. And so we get roughly almost 1,000 calls a year usually from Native parents, relatives who are involved in some kind of child welfare proceeding. Most of the time it's in a state. And a lot of them are actually not eligible for the protections of the Indian Child Welfare Act. They're descendants, but they're not members of federally recognized tribes. But interestingly, the federal law in child welfare has been getting closer and closer to what ICWA is. So there's now, all states are supposed to provide notice whenever they take a child into all of their adult relatives within 30 days. So it's really looking at the extended family and those connections. So that doesn't necessarily, you don't have to be eligible for ICWA's protections to receive that. Another piece of, and that law has been on the books since 2008. And another one that's even older requires states to first consider relatives for the placement of a child, like in foster care or guardianship or something. And you know, I'll be the first to admit that a lot of these are not complied with very well. Those notices don't go out. The relative placements don't happen as much as they should. But nonetheless, there's more and more, I would say, kind of push to make sure that in child welfare, we're making decisions that reflect the needs of children, not just physical or emotional needs, educational needs, but also their cultural needs, and looking at them from a holistic perspective too. So that's what I would say about the child welfare side of this.
It looks like we have a hand, Sally.
I actually have two questions. They're sort of related, but maybe not. So the first one is, who is it that, federally and state-wise, who is deciding about recognizing a tribe, and what are the criteria? Should I ask both my questions at once? Because they're sort of related. So my second question is, within tribes, is there some generally accepted way that it is decided who is a member of a tribe, or, does each tribe have their own system, completely different kinds of systems for deciding that?
Sally, I'm going to answer part of your question with a biased comment. The federal government decides who is a federally recognized tribe. It's an incredibly difficult process for a tribe. One of the things that makes it so difficult is the required proof that you've been in existence. And that proof can come in the form of things that are alien to us, such as birth certificates, baptismal records, other forms of being counted as a citizen of a state or a county, school records. These things don't necessarily exist, for example, in my grandparents' time, or even myself. I don't have a regular birth certificate. I have what Obama has. So we know for sure I was born. However, I don't have a birth certificate that would be recognized by the federal government. I do have a fake one that I use because I was a foster kid and an adopted kid. So I use that one as opposed to my original proof of birth. Secondly, when it comes to how a tribe decides who its citizens are, that's up to each tribe. And unfortunately, one of the issues of contemporary times is disenrollment. And I'm very proud of Lewis and Clark Law School. We've had Gabe Galenda here to talk about the issue of disenrollment. And it's a painful thing for people. And, using Gabe's word, 99% of disenrollment of people, frankly, is based on money, on resources. And tribes, there's not a legal venue to fight disenrollment. And sometimes tribes will take another look at what they're requiring for citizenship, whether it's blood quantum or whether it's kinship, but it's an issue within our tribal nations also. Tawny, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I do want to clarify that sort of the recognition of tribes themselves is is more new than because from a way back, of course, there were many tribes that signed direct treaties with the United States government, and so those ones are like they were the I don't know, some number of tribes. Coming forward, you have many tribes who existed and maybe avoided the government or existed, and then we talk about the David mentioned the PL 280 and those tribes who were then there's other tribes that were terminated. So becoming sort of re-recognized or recognized again by the United States government, that's where the process comes in that Dr. Corcoran was talking about, sort of what that takes to get there. My father's tribe actually is one of the tribes, the Carrizo, that are, they're not federally recognized. And so they are working on that process, basically having to, pull up all of as much history as we possibly can that's written to prove that they in fact existed there. Not to mention their cliff writings on the wall. That should have said something, but maybe not. So just so you understand, maybe it's more of a newer process of having to prove who you are, that you have been there for a very long time. With regard to tribes and their recognition of who is a tribal member or how to recognize them, that has been shifting and changing for a lot of tribes, because one of the things that we recognize is that despite the fact that blood quantum was a huge issue. Blood quantum was do you understand blood quantum? Do people need a little bit of a primer on blood quantum? Anybody? Okay. I see.
Yeah, if you can just explain briefly, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
You have parent 1, parent 2. Parent 1, full-blooded Lakota, parent 2, full-blooded Cheyenne. They get married, have a kid that's half Cheyenne and half Lakota. You can only be enrolled in one tribe. So if that half Cheyenne, half Lakota person marries somebody who's half Navajo and half Hopi, that's 4 tribes. You can only be enrolled in one tribe at a quarter. So it used to be that 1/4 blood quantum was about the lowest you could go before you were essentially non-existent. And it was an effort by the United States government to essentially wash us out. Right. And so many of the tribes decided, okay, well, we're going to do this different. We're going to recognize other federally recognized tribal blood quantums. So in my son's dad's tribe, they do that. My federally recognized blood quantum is is recognized by my son's dad's tribe. So he's enrolled in his dad's tribe, but he's in fact enrolled higher blood quantum than his dad, because my federally recognized blood quantum was counted as well. So that was the ability for that tribe to keep their tribal population alive and thriving, because they were recognizing other federally recognized tribes' blood quantum. And our own tribes are doing somewhat the similar type of thing, recognizing, yes, your blood quantum may be somewhat diminished and or, maybe at or below that 1/4 blood quantum, but we will still recognize you as a tribal member because of your engagement and all of that with the tribe itself. So it's so it's still up to the tribes. That original blood quantum effort trying to eliminate tribal populations existed and still does to a degree, but the tribes are doing their best in some instances to eliminate that problem. So.
Did you get your answer, Sally?
It's complicated.
Does anybody else have a comment or question? David, I see you're off mute.
Well, I'm just going to add to, when it comes to, in the Brackeen case, one of the things that the state of Texas is trying to do is they're trying to make tribal citizenship be, the court think that tribal citizenship is only about blood quantum and racial categorization. And actually many tribes have they have multiple criteria about who can be a member in their tribe. So, and some of it's not based on blood quantum, or it's based on other issues too. So it can be matrilineal or patrilineal descendancy too. So there's a number of different issues. So to reduce tribal membership to just one simple thing is just not possible, really.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions for the speakers? Barbara?
Yeah, I have one. I put it in the chat, and that was Representative Sanchez talked about the, I can't quite remember what bill it was, but it was the one where the education around Native life was to be embedded in the curriculum in Oregon. And she mentioned that that's not really happening on a widespread basis. And so I just wanted to see if there was any suggestions or thoughts about what we as citizens could do to maybe help promote that.
So I have thoughts about it. So what we hear oftentimes from school districts and school systems is like, oh my God, we have so much to teach. We have so much that we're required to do, blah, 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 blah. And we just don't have time. Or we just don't want to, you know, we don't want to rock the boat. We don't want to, you know, whatever reasons that they give, which are irrelevant in my opinion. I think what is necessary, and part of the reason we passed the law in the first place, is to really help people recognize that that understanding of Native issues, Native American issues, you know, the struggles in the past and why we are where we are, usually doesn't occur for your average, you know, student until they're in college, right? They don't get a lot of this information until they get to college. And so trying to get that to happen much sooner, at a much younger age, and to have it be embedded with Oregon tribal information versus what kids often learn about in school, which is, you know, Wounded Knee, or in South Dakota, the Lakota's people, or the Trail of Tears, or something of that nature, which is fine and great information, but it doesn't do anything for the tribes here in Oregon. Sometimes that might be just petitioning your school district and bringing it up to the school board and saying, this is information that is out there. It is required. You know, it's happening. You have to force your teaching staff to actually teach it.
Thank you for that, Rep. Sanchez. Is there any other questions? I think it's really important, you know, that we have discussions like this. One of something that always comes to my mind when we talk about education and I guess privilege would be like, you know, what I've explained to people, you know, especially Caucasian people, is that your history is being taught as a core curriculum and mine is being taught as an elective. I think it's really important that we continue to have conversations like this, and that we continue to share information about sovereignty, because of our education system is, you know, a huge reason why a lot of this information is lost. You know, I used to get frustrated. I mean, I'm Native American. I'm from a federally recognized tribe. I grew up on the reservation. I moved here, so I have those different frames of reference around, you know, tribal sovereignty, being Native, understanding it from both sides. And I understand that education needs to be at the forefront. And sometimes, you know, I went through a phase where I just would get upset and say, I don't want to tell you. I don't want to talk to you. I don't want to have that conversation. But then I realized, you know, if I don't tell you and I'm the only person that you've come across, how are you going to know? And, you know, it could protect somebody from having a traumatizing conversation. So, you know, I think it's very important that we continue to have these conversations and understand tribal sovereignty and Native issues, Native, you know, things that are moving. One of the things I'm extremely passionate about is the boarding school era. You know, I think we all are descendants of boarding school, you know, in some form or another, but I was raised on them. I was raised on those stories. And I know that that was a huge hit to Native American people and families moving forward. And so, you know, in order for healing to happen, acknowledgement of what happened needs to happen. It's a lot of happens, but you know, we need to move towards reparations and more importantly, information about what has happened, because I've visited Carlisle Indian School. You know, I needed to do that for myself because that was the first boarding school, and it was the first of many. And so, you know, seeing those unmarked or those graves that are marked unknown made me so angry because they didn't take the time to learn that child's name, and that child never went home. And so that family line is fractured. And so, you know, I know that people tend to lump BIPOC or use that terminology freely, and I understand, you know, everybody is in the best interest of time. We want to shorten this long group of words or ethnic groups, but Native American people deserve that acknowledgement because our existence is proof that we're still here. And, you know, we survived genocide and we survived numerous attacks on our people. So, I mean, that's just my 2 cents on it. Does anybody else have anything that it looks like Gary put something in the chat? Until tribal understanding isn't an automatic thing that everyday people consider and think of, the education requirements is obviously necessary. Even more, we need to educate adults. Absolutely. Absolutely. Representative Sanchez, you are on mute.
I'm just saying that's perfect. Thank you. Gary, that is really an important way to say it. So thanks so much, folks.